Let's talk about G by E and conservation science. I think it fits with the theme of the spring's Rough Cut series, where it's largely been interdisciplinary environmental sciences. I really enjoyed hearing from many of our faculty in this topic, and they both talked about case studies that they were involved with that were interdisciplinary, but also some of them identified lessons learned. And I think compiling those talks and those key points will be really relevant to IOE's ongoing discussions about how to do more interdisciplinary research. So I'd like to today just continue in that kind of theme of looking at two case studies, one being a paper that we just submitted, an analysis that we just submitted for publication. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that one. And then the second is just a pre-proposal, basically an idea, but I think it's pretty relevant to the interdisciplinary studies theme. And I think there's some good points for discussion among us in that portion of the presentation. So I'm going to try to both talk about the issues and the research results, but then also try to put it in the context of how do we work across disciplines. So this project, we were just talking about Zambia and large mammals and connectivity in Yellowstone and Florida for panthers. This work was really aimed at trying to move past the kind of science that my lab has been doing for now decades in Yellowstone to understand pattern and process and vulnerability to trying to produce maps that are going to be used to inform conservation. Have you found it surprisingly hard to actually have your science be used for real world stuff? Anyway, that's what this is aimed at. By trying to basically identify what are really if you had to pick the top 5% of places to focus conservation on, what would those be? It's a fun project because it involved several undergrad and grad students here at MSU from LRES and the Ecology department. And then also Arthur Middleton from Berkeley and Laura Gigliotti, who's been working with him. She's now in West Virginia. They've focused on elk studies. And then Frank Van Manen and Mark Haraldson from the interagency grizzly bear study team. And then Dave Theobald and Nathaniel Robinson that I've been working with for quite a while. So you can already begin to see that, just based on this list of authors, the diversity of subdisciplines that come to play here. And again, the essence of this project was really trying to produce something that practitioners would find valuable and want to use in the simplest possible way so that it's tangible and it's tractable and it's usable. And when it comes to conservation, pretty darn complex, lots of response variables. Biodiversity is everything under the sun, right? So this focuses on, quote, natural habitats. Natural habitats. The whole theme of this is how do we maintain remaining natural habitats. And when I think about global conservation, that I think that's the cornerstone of the strategies that have been put forth in almost every setting. And it's because natural habitats provide ecosystem services, and store carbon and have a lot of values that, that we really care about. And so the questions we ask here, the more general question globally, fundamentally, is we know that we can't protect everywhere, so which are the places that are the highest priorities? And globally, there's all kinds of efforts to answer that. And if we look at the global situation, you know, all the pink stuff here is pretty much not natural anymore. Almost 60% of the terrestrial globe. And as a consequence, international policy now focuses on trying to maintain some 30% of that land area in natural ecosystem condition by 2030. So at the international level, there's a high priority on this question of natural habitats. And this schematic is pretty widely used internationally. Again, it's largely aimed at no net loss of natural habitats. And so the key is to avoid these arrows that go away from current natural habitats, and trying to maintain those as well as restore some places that are already transformed. U.S. Again, we don't have a national biodiversity strategy per se, but both Congress and the White House here in the last 2 years have come on board with the goal of trying to maintain 30% of the U.S. land area in a natural condition, at least in a conservation status. Private lands, of course, have to play a big role in trying to achieve that across the U.S. This is just a map from Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, up Oregon, Washington, from a project we just finished last year. That's showing in purple federal lands and yellow tribal lands. I'm sorry, yeah, so public, the yellows are public and tribal, and then of course purple is private. And particularly in our region, you see that whereas the majority of this is federal, the private lands are really in kind of key places. And we know that they're really important ecologically. Higher productivity, supporting larger number of species, often species that are not well represented in public lands. The major way that those private lands are conserved is through the conservation easement initiative. You know, it's all voluntary conservation that's happening on the private lands. And so the easement program that the land trusts are doing becomes really important. GYE, of course, is a place where this stuff really matters because we have a lot of natural habitats. We have a lot of species that depend on them. We also have a fast-growing population and building human pressures. So basically, we tried to ask what would a no net loss of habitat strategy look like in this system. In particular, where are those remaining natural habitats on private land? And which would we say are the highest priorities from a biodiversity point of view? And then to what extent have easements been used to protect those kind of places? So again, it's really aimed at trying to produce products that could really be used for planning and for implementation of easements. Of course, GYE is such a wonderful place, and we used an ecoregional boundary to define this, the EPA ecoregion boundary. But notice that whereas analyses were done over the whole system, they were also done within Huck 6 and 8 watersheds that were defined based on the watershed boundaries, but also on rates of population growth and land use change. Because there's it turns out there's a lot of variation in the questions that we're asking across these different parts of the ecosystem. So we came up with a definition of what we're calling natural vegetation cover. So I won't go into details here. And then we basically mapped that natural vegetation cover and two other classes, developed and agriculture. Based largely on satellite-derived national data sets from USGS and from one that Dave Theobald did. And we were able to do the maps for the time period of 2001 to 2019. So we largely basically mapped those habitats in the two time periods and then looked at change between the two to try to identify where were natural habitats being lost during that 20-year period. And for the biodiversity stuff, again, we really tried to take the complexities of all that's involved with, say, ecosystem integrity, ecosystem structure and function and composition. Like, there's more than 30 response indicators that the international program is using relating to biodiversity. So here we're basically boiling it down to 3 layers. The first, ecological value, is the more complex one. It was our attempt to represent all kinds of ecosystem integrity stuff. So some relating to ecosystem function like permanent productivity, and then structure in terms of landscape connectivity and composition in terms of species richness, but also ecosystem type representation and imperiled species. We combined all those into this one index we call ecological value. And then at the start of the project, I had been talking with Arthur Middleton, who of course was quite involved in the National Geographic year of Yellowstone and really did the core work that National Geographic focused on with regard to elk. As really the charismatic species that is central to ecosystem function, but also to how people relate to the area. And he suggested, well, let's put charismatic wildlife into the mix here quite directly. And so they had just completed this analysis of elk winter, summer, and migration habitats over the full ecosystem based on GPS data from all the data available basically in the ecosystem. And so we basically just had a yes/no for elk migration and or winter range habitat as our response variable. Again, trying to keep it as simple as possible. And then the grizzly bear data set we used was basically modeled female grizzly survival that was done by the interagency grizzly bear study team. They had identified a particular level of female survival associated with population source areas, with populations stable or growing versus sink areas. And so we just used a map of source sink, basically source areas, as the grizzly biodiversity data layer. And then Um, we were interested in, well, what are the landscape attributes of each of these biodiversity layers? So these were some of the predictors we used in that analysis. And then in terms of how do you combine these, we just simply overlaid them to identify where is it, yes, for ecological value, for elk, for grizzlies, or for two of them, or for all three of them. And then we drew on the National Conservation Easement Database to map out where have the easements been placed in Yellowstone, and what proportion of them are really aimed at biodiversity, the so-called environmental type of easement, as opposed to open space or other types of easements. So this is showing private lands in GYE, and the green are the ones that remain natural in this natural vegetation cover. It's about 81%. Turns out that's about as large as any ecoregion in the Northwest in terms of remaining natural. So that's a big plus, means there's lots of opportunities here for trying to maintain that. And then ag and developed 14 and 5%. Of course, here's where the variation in watersheds come in. You know, some places like the Wind River watershed, there's not that much private land, much of it's tribal, and it's largely in natural cover. But of course, the Gallatin watershed just stands out among all the watershed, the 9 watersheds, in terms of over 40% of its ag were developed. So it's the variation among watersheds that really becomes a big message, I think, in terms of conservation planning. So during that 20-year period, only about 1% of that natural vegetation cover was converted to ag or developed. And the red places are showing here in our part of this ecosystem where that happened. Again, many watersheds had almost no loss, but we had up to 6% here, and Snake Headwaters the same. And again, by the standards of across the Pacific and inland Northwest, this is just about as high as anywhere for this watershed. Of course, this is what it looks like, you know, as an aerial photo. These roads here off Bozeman Pass and reaching out to rural homes. This is an example of the type of land use change that is eating into those natural habitats. And as I mentioned on campus before, when you express this in terms of the per capita, for each person that lives in the area, how much habitat was destroyed, again, in an attempt to make this tangible people, how much is me as an average Bozemanite, how much have I consumed? How does that compare to Seattleites and others? Well, we're number 8 out of 99, roughly. We're consuming heavily. And then in terms of the interdisciplinary aspect, we worked with Katrina Mullen, an economist at U of M, to basically really try to understand what were the correlates, what were the potential drivers of this loss of natural habitat. And it's a bunch of social stuff like U.S. demographics, and it's economic stuff like distance to markets. Of course, it's also natural amenities, proximity to national parks and water bodies, etc. So that becomes quite important in terms of trying to assess risk to the remaining places. Which ones are more likely to be vulnerable here in the future? But just these predictors, don't they illustrate how when we talk about, conservation in these western landscapes, it really does take expertise from social science, from economics, from policy, from natural sciences. To really try to deal with the issues. So just in brief, these are how the three biodiversity layers mapped out. Again, this is just on the natural vegetation cover. If we start at the valley bottoms and work up, of course, the elk winter habitat is mostly in the valley bottoms, and the migration habitat is on in the toe slopes of the mountains largely, in the lower forest tree line. That same lower forest tree line is also relatively high in the areas of high ecological value, and that's true particularly here in the northern end of ecosystem. The red stuff here is the grizzly bear source habitat. But it jumps out that there's not much of it on private lands. Just 5% of the natural vegetation cover qualifies as bear habitat. That's largely because bears just can't handle people. And the interagency bear team, has done really great work quantifying the effects of rural homes on bear survival and road crossings, population density, and building structures, and find that almost all those places that have even very low levels of human pressure are population sick areas. So when you put those three together, so here now we're looking at where one biodiversity layer, 2 or 3 are met. And look across the whole study area, you see that only 5% has all 3 layers. And I guess, from an conservation easement point of view, hopefully this is useful, because whereas we might emphasize the areas where all 3 overlap are highest priorities, some land trusts might really want to focus on grizzly bears or on elk or on species richness of birds, and so these maps should be helpful, but it also demonstrates the type of data that can be brought to bear to guide conservation for other interests as well. But the 5% was rather startling to me. Of course, we all love maps. Where are those places? Well, you were just skiing at Big Sky Saturday, and I was in Beehive. So that's pretty close to home. It's the place where the 3 layers perhaps most overlap. And then look at a fair whack of that 5% has been lost over that last 20 years in the Big Sky area. And Big Sky scores high because, of course, you'd expect it to be high for elk and for ecological value, but also it's a community built in the wilderness, basically. And so it all was grizzly bear source area. And the parts of it that are not yet too heavily penetrated still are, but that's being eroded quickly as homes have expanded there and so forth. And then down in Idaho, in the Star Valley, this is just another example of where those 3 layers tend to overlap. These are the easements that have been mapped across the ecosystem. It's about 16% of that natural vegetation cover. That's pretty cool. That's way higher than other ecoregions here. And look at our area of Gallatin County and Madison County, where we're building and so forth. We have the highest proportion of easements here. When we look at that 5% of the land, how much of it's in easements? Well, about a quarter of it is. So the easements have, to some extent, slightly targeted that 5%, not deliberately probably, but based on they didn't have our analysis, but still there's been a slightly disproportionate placement in those areas. But it does point out that still the 75% of that 5% is not in easements. And so again, there's real opportunity to focus on that. And that's really the big conclusion that we would draw from this, that these types of data can really perhaps help guide really where are the most critical places so that we can try to enact that net loss strategy in those places. Before I briefly talk about the pre-proposal, I just wondered what y'all comments about this part of it.
I guess I had a question. With the grizzly bear, it looked like you were mapping mostly the source areas. Did you do the sinks as well? Because potentially the sinks, would be a high value area to potentially look at the causes of why they're sinks, like to improve survival in those areas, and might expand a lot more of the area that would overlap.
Arthur Middleton said the same thing. That could well be a focus for restoration. And he was emphasizing that it's not only for the private lands, but some of the public lands are sink areas because of heavy hiking pressure or edge effects from homes and all. It turned out the interagency bear guys didn't want to go there. The politics of the bear issue are so substantial that they're sticking with what they've done so far. They have a bunch of new science happening, but they don't talk about it much till it's published. But I think that's a really good point, and what it really relates to basically the notion of living with dangerous wildlife, doesn't it? How can we learn to not have activities that are leading to us needing to kill bears, basically, to protect people. I see there was just an interesting case in Italy where a brown bear that was one of the few that were restored in the Alps, and was well known for the past 20 years, killed a person. Really raising this issue of how do we handle that? It seemed like, when I read, the majority of the public favored not killing the bear.
Maybe I have a question following up on that. That there was a relatively large red blob between Ennis and Big Sky that was bear source habitat. So can you talk about where is that exactly, or what habitat is that? It's private land, and
Yeah, I think that's all the Jack Creek area.
is it? Okay. So and how much?
Which you know well.
Yeah. And how much pressure is there, like between 2019 and right now? That's the other half of the question is, what else has been decided? It seems like these changes in land ownership are happening so fast.
So basically we're not able to get the satellite data to do this classification past 2019. That USGS layer is only updated periodically. And it's really highly relevant, isn't it? Because of what we think are big increases in rates of growth in buildings since COVID. Yeah.
Wasn't there some sort of opening up of or development happening in Jack Creek past year or two? It was being debated. I don't know if they were counting.
Well, so I think at a minimum, they're now allowing workers at Big Sky to use the road to commute to Innis. So many of them are living in Innis. And so that's one very substantial change. But on the other hand, this Jack Creek Preserve is privately owned, but I think dedicated to conservation primarily. And the owner has been working with Diana and the Department of Ecology for environmental education and conservation and so forth there. But those individual properties become so pivotal in all this. You know what I think about so much of this is here. There's something about Yellowstone where everybody that really cares about science and conservation has just got so much going on in their own networks that a lot falls through the cracks. So I have gotten almost no response from the land trust community from this work, including a presentation, I did at the Museum of the Rockies last month. I think there was one person from the land trust that was at that event. The land trusts, as we've been told by Catherine Kelly and others, they pretty heavily go to properties for which there's opportunity. A landowner approaches them rather than a priori selection. Or to a small extent, they have a few scientists on board, various land trusts, and develop some data layers. But there's not, other than the Nature Conservancy, as far as I know, there's just not an objective land prioritization scheme to identify where conservation easements for biodiversity would be placed. We just don't do that. There's so much working with individual landowners and working with their donors that it's just not organized in that. And then the land trusts largely have a geography way smaller than Yellowstone, Gallatin Valley, Montana, Teton Valley. That's the scale at which the land trusts are operating. So it's just an example of how the authority, the interest in the authority to operate over a large landscape of multiple ownerships is largely just not there. So even for the elk, nobody has jurisdiction, basically, or authority to do an elk conservation plan over GYE. So, of course, within each state, they do, but the states are not coordinating. So again, when it comes to interdisciplinarity, it's just really, if we had done the same analysis for the Upper Missouri watershed in Montana, I think there'd be all kinds of interest because it does fit with jurisdictions of regulating agencies and with policy interests and with land trusts. The geography is a challenge, really. So to just wrap things up, just thinking about rough cut series and interdisciplinary studies across IOE. It's been a pretty good year. Huh? The funding that became available through the MSU Foundation allowed us to fund these 3 projects that we heard about. Whereby new teams have developed to do interdisciplinary stuff on water quality and on natural river ecology and on prairie restoration through bison. We're hoping that a research experience for undergraduates proposal will go forward, which could be a big positive step. We're just about ready to select and announce PhD students to be funded under the Yellowstone Graduate Fellowship Program. And then we developed a couple of initiatives within the MSU Foundation that might resonate with philanthropists. So Kathy Whitlock has led this one on climate change, and then we have one on Yellowstone. So there's a lot of good things happening, I think. And so it's kind of fun to end the year on just a note of, it's like we're on a good track, and next year ought to be better. Okay, well, thanks, folks, for joining in and for comments. And let's hope we can all survive the rest of the semester and have a good summer. And see us back here next fall.
Thank you.